but by amending the clause itself. Some food for thought, Minister.
Dr. Kennedy-Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one further and I think final comment on my previous point about 11B, picking up from Grant Robertson's intervention, which I thought was very useful. Obviously, it is in the same sub-clause, the international relations and well-being of New Zealand, and he then inferred that the two are somehow interrelated. That may be, but it's not clear in the legislation, and it isn't a necessary inference. So we have to conclude, I think, that the concept well-being of New Zealand stands on its own, separate and discrete. And I still think it is problematic if it is left undefined. National security, as I say, is there in 55A. But if you, and we do traditionally understand what we mean by international relations, you could say the positive international, to meet Mr. Robertson's point, you could say the positive international relations of New Zealand. But if you just say well-being of New Zealand, it's wide open to abuse or maximum and broad interpretation. I'll give you just one quick example. If a country that relies and embraces the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, for example, would presumably interpret the well-being of that country to include the possession and potential use of nuclear weapons. New Zealand, on the other hand, has legislation that disavows the possession of nuclear weapons for itself. So presumably, therefore, necessarily, the well-being of New Zealand rests on a repudiation of nuclear deterrence. Now, those are diametrically opposed concepts. So you could have, in intelligence legislation in two countries, if it were Five Eyes, partners engaging in espionage on two different people who are saying entirely different things on the grounds that it is meeting their legislation. And I know we're just talking about New Zealand, but I think it reinforces and highlights the problematic nature of a broad concept that is undefined when there are criminal penalties in the same bill. And on reflection, we did not put it into an SOP. The same problem does not pertain to national security because 55A2B or D, I think, talks about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So the concept of national security is constrained and defined. Well-being is not anywhere in the bill. So we may want to, before we conclude the passage of the bill through the House, just reflect further whether 11B might be better served if it were an appropriate adjective in front of international relations and the undefined concept of well-being omitted. Thanks.
Nika Waitiri.